Hello, I'm Morgan Haig and welcome back to In the Frame. In this episode we're going to be looking at one of the oldest artworks from the collection of the National Gallery in London. It is of course the Wilton Diptych. Now this is a fascinating object. It comes probably from the last couple of years of the 14th century, 1398, 1399. We know it was probably made in England or possibly northern France. We have no idea who created it. The craftspeople didn't leave their names, they're lost to history, as is the case with most artworks from the Middle Ages. They simply weren't signed. But we do know for whom it was made. Richard II, King of England. The boy king whose reign, very troubled reign, resulted in much of the Wars of the Roses in the decades and centuries that followed. Now, it's called the Wilton Diptych. What is a diptych? Well, diptych is a two-panelled object. So a two-panelled object is a diptych, a three-panelled object is a triptych, and then anything above three tends to be referred to as a polytych, meaning many panels, because art historians are lazy and can't be bothered to count more than three. So this is a diptych. It's two wooden panels made of oak, joined in the middle with some hinges so it can open and close like a book. And indeed it is about the size of a large hardback coffee table book, but no bigger than that. And there's a very good reason for that. It was probably Richard II's travelling altarpiece. It would go with him when he was on campaign, particularly when he fought wars in Ireland, and would be set up as temporary altars in his camps as he travelled round. So it has to be quite small and easily transportable. The fact it can open and close, as many diptychs can, is extremely useful for preserving the beautiful designs on the inside. It can be shut up and then carried around without risking damaging the beautiful gold designs on the inside. And as we will see shortly, the outer panels certainly show the damage of all of that transport and storage over the years. Richard himself features in the diptych, as do many of his patron saints, as do angels, the Virgin, Christ. We're going to have a look at who's in it, why they're in it, what the symbolism of the design suggests, and what it tells us about Richard's reign, his very interesting idea of kingship, and the troubled end that it came to. So who is Richard II, King of England? Well, his father was the Black Prince, the famous fighter in the 100 Years' War, and his father in turn was the King Edward III. Now the Black Prince, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, died tragically before his father did, and so the role of heir passed to the King's grandson, Richard. Richard was extremely young at this point. Now, when Edward III eventually died, Richard was still only 10 years old, and so he ascended to the throne in the summer of his 11th year. And as a precaution, while he was still a boy and learning the skills of kingship, his uncle John of Gaunt, another son of Edward III, was appointed to be his protector. Now, it's not a smooth beginning to Richard's reign. In 1381, he's only 14, he still hasn't assumed the full powers of a king. He has to see off the peasants' revolt when a chap called Wat Tyler raises up a large amount of the peasant population of Britain and marches on London. And according to accounts, the young Richard, 14 years old, rides out into the crowd upon his horse and speaks to them, convinces them to stick with him, to follow him as their king, and he gets away with it. The peasant revolt is averted thanks to Richard's speech. This is what they tell us, at least. Then in 1388, he still hasn't really adopted the full role of king. Many of the barons find that the people around him, his friends who were advising him, including the Earl of Oxford, are not the kind of people they feel the king ought to be associating with. They feel like they're giving him bad advice, and so they arrange a kind of coup and basically purge Richard's court of most of his friends, which tends to turn Richard against many of his barons in the years to come. Because once he does assume the full powers of kingship, in the 1390s, he acts in a very autocratic way, ruling almost entirely on his own without consulting many of his barons, going off fighting campaigns in Ireland, and this certainly causes many of his nobles to become disaffected with his rule, including Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. He'll pop back into our story later on. So that's the case of Richard and what's happening with him up until the point that the Wilton Diptych is created. So let's have a look at the two inner panels of the diptych. This is where the real meat of the subject matter is. On the left, you can see Richard himself kneeling in the foreground, and stood behind him you have three men with halos. On the other side, on the right-hand panel, you have the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, and they're surrounded by 11 beautiful, almost identical angels in this wonderful ultramarine blue fabric. And they're stood on this grassy floral carpet, and they were presenting across the divide of the two panels this standard with the cross of St. George on a flag at the very top of it. And the background of both panels, the whole thing, is covered in gold. And this is gold leaf that has been applied to wooden panels that have been tooled. So you can see there's this kind of texture, different textures in different places. And that's where the wood has been carved away and has been worked into with metal tools. And then the gold leaf has been placed on top, pushed into this kind of textured pattern to give it this amazing shimmering effect, which would have been heightened even more with it on an altar with candles burning beneath, creating this wonderful, wonderful effect, this kind of glowing, shimmering effect. So let's have a look first at the left-hand panel. There he is, Richard II, looking very young. As I mentioned, only 10 years old when he's crowned. So this is obviously, although it comes from the final years of his reign, probably an image of his youth, possibly even a kind of grand metaphor for his coronation, as we'll see shortly. But there he is, kneeling in the foreground, wearing this extraordinary cloak. Now, what's happened here is a technique known as sgraffito, where paint has been applied over the top of that gold backing, and then designs have been scratched into that paint to reveal the gold underneath. And so you can see the gold coming through the red on his cloak, and all over the cloak are the symbol of the white hart, which you'll spot everywhere in this. This was Richard's own personal symbol, adopted from his mother, Joan of Kent. It was taken up as his own personal badge. And so it's all over his cloak. It's also, as you can see in a little badge, a little brooch keeping his cloak shut just above his hands. You can see an enamel brooch there. Around his neck he has broom pods, or golden versions of broom pods. Now, the broom pod became a very important symbol for the Plantagenet dynasty because the Latin for the common broom plant is planta genista, which of course sounds very similar to Plantagenet, the dynasty to which Richard belonged. So that's a reference to his lineage. And obviously on his head there is this crown, once again tooled in gold, with little blobs of shimmering paint that give the suggestion of jewels in the crown. Now, stood behind him, as I mentioned, are these three gentlemen. Starting with the one nearest to him, the figure on the right with his hand around the back of the king's head is John the Baptist. You can tell because of his fur cloak that he's wearing, he's carrying the lamb, the symbolic image of John the Baptist, the figure who baptized Christ. Now, why is St. John there? Well, he's there because Richard ascended to the throne on the eve of the vigil of John the Baptist. So he's linked with the event of Richard's coronation and ascension to the throne. The next figure in the middle, is also haloed, so he's also a saint, but this figure has a crown as well. He's wearing white, he has this wonderful beard, and he's holding a bejewelled ring in his fingers. This figure is Edward the Confessor. Now, of course, if you know the history of 1066, you'll know that Edward the Confessor was a monarch, the King of England. He was the figure whose death kick-started the whole fight over who had the right to the throne of England, and resulted in the Battle of Hastings and the coronation of William the Conqueror. But Edward the Confessor himself has been made a saint. His relics are in Westminster Abbey, where Richard was crowned. So he's not only a king of England, but also a saint. So you can see the connection for Richard is very, very strong. The ring he's holding is in reference to a rather bizarre story from the life of Edward the Confessor. And I had to look this up in my convenient dictionary of saints to find what was going on here. But according to legend, King Edward was travelling through Essex. He comes across a church that is being consecrated in the name of John the Evangelist. And so he goes in and he prays, and then an old beggar comes up to him and asks for a donation to the church. And the king looks around and he realises that the keeper of the royal purse is not in fact with him. And so he takes a ring off his finger and gives it to the beggar, and the beggar thanks him profusely. Many years later, English pilgrims are travelling around the Holy Land. They are lost in the desert, and suddenly they come across an old man, and he says, "I will give you shelter. I will take you in and give you shelter." And they say, "Thank you very much." And then while they're staying with this old man, they tell him that they're from England. And he says, "I remember England very well. Is your king, King Edward, still in good health?" And the pilgrims say, they say, "Yes, well, I mean, he's doing all right, but he's quite old now." And the beggar says, "See this ring that I'm wearing? Take this back to England with you and give it to your king, and tell him that John the Evangelist sends his regards." And so the pilgrims take the ring and they travel back to England and they present it to Edward the Confessor, and lo and behold, it is the very ring that he gave to the beggar on that day in Essex. And he realises that the beggar himself was John the Evangelist. So that's the story of why he's got the ring in his hand. The final figure on the left is yet another king and saint. This is Edmund, king and martyr. He was king of one of the ancient kingdoms in Britain. He was martyred by being shot with arrows while tied to a tree, and so that is why he has an arrow in his hand. He has the crown on his head to represent his kingdom. So two of the figures there are British kings and saints. So there's an obvious connection there with Richard. The other link, again with his coronation, is that Edmund's slippers and Edward's crown were both used as props in the coronation ceremony of Richard II. So all three of these saints stood behind him have direct links with that day. John the Baptist for the date, and the other two kings for their possessions that were used in the process. So now let's have a look at the other panel that faces it on the right-hand side. So in the right-hand panel, we have the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ right at the centre there. Around them are 11 angels, all in this beautiful ultramarine blue colour, which is still so vivid after all of the centuries, the Virgin Mary wearing the same colour herself. They have this fantastic collection of wings behind them, all of these quite minutely detailed, in fact, feathery wings that create this gorgeous backdrop to the whole scene. And they are stood on top of this floral grassy carpet, and the idea here seems to be that they are in heaven. This is the heavenly realm, indicated by that wonderful kind of bountiful carpet below them, this verdant setting, but also the difference in texture in the gold tooling in the background. It's far more kind of shimmery than that in the world that Richard and his saints are positioned on the other panel. Now, why are there 11 angels? Well, there's many different reasons suggested for this. Partly it could be because Richard was in his 11th year when he became king, if we're continuing that coronation metaphor from the other panel. Or it could be because he was married to Anne of Bohemia, his beloved wife, for 11 years before her untimely death. Could be that, could also be that just you can't really fit any more angels onto the panel. As you can see, it's already quite crowded. There could be a hidden meaning in it, there could not be, we simply don't know. What is clear is that the artists are claiming that all of these angels are supporters of King Richard, because you can see they're all wearing that badge of the white hart, that symbol that is associated with Richard. It's on his chest, it's on his cloak, it's even on the outer panels of the diptych. You can see it large scale on the outside, although obviously much more damaged than the inside over the years. So the suggestion here is that they are his supporters, and they would be echoing many of the nobles at Richard's court, who would also be wearing identical badges in real life if they were a supporter of the king. And there are other badges, not of Richard's white hart, but for example of a swan, that survive, that show this kind of thing was common in the era. So everyone in this panel on the right hand side seems to be referencing, referring, looking to Richard and his saints in the other panel opposite. And even the Christ child leans forward and with his hands seems to offer this standard with the flag of St. George on top of it, seems to be offering it across the divide to Richard, who is kneeling in the left-hand panel. So what we have here is possibly a visual metaphor for his coronation. Those three saints all have a link with his coronation. He is depicted as looking very young, probably around the age he was when he was crowned. And at the moment of coronation, the whole idea is that God grants the power to rule England. He gives England to the king, to Richard in this case. And so here we have that action of Christ offering England, represented as this standard, across to Richard. There are a few extra little details in this panel which I think are fascinating. Firstly, you can see that the Virgin is holding the infant Christ's foot, as if to display the area where the stigmata will eventually be, where the wounds of the crucifixion will appear through his foot. At this stage, of course, not yet happened. And if you look very carefully, and it's hard to show in a photograph, but in Christ's halo, again tooled into the wood and then covered in gold, so it just appears as a kind of embossed pattern, is a crown of thorns, which you can only see from certain angles and certain lights as it's picked out. So there's this kind of shimmering portent of what will happen to the infant Christ ultimately. So a fascinating panel in itself, this image of heaven. But there are some further secrets that I'll look at just at the very end. Before that, I wanted to have a brief look at the outer panels. We've already seen the white hart on the one side, quite badly damaged. On the other side, on the outer panel, you have Richard's own personal crest, his own heraldry, in which you can see the crest of the royal family, but cut in half with the crest of Edward the Confessor. Now this dividing of the shield is normally only done in the circumstance of marriage, but in this case Richard has divided his own shield, symbolically wedding himself to the idea of kingly sainthood, the idea of Edward the Confessor being this figure that Richard should emulate. So it's a fascinating thing, and you can see the damage on these panels is much more significant than those on the inside. And thankfully it is, because these have protected, in fact, that amazing design inside, which is hardly blemished by the centuries that have passed. An amazing, amazing survival. But let's have a look at that extra little detail that I mentioned in the right-hand panel, which is my favourite part of this whole artwork. If we are to look at the top of that standard in the right-hand panel, looking above the flag of St. George, you'll see a tiny little orb. Now, in cleaning in the early part of this century, they revealed inside that orb these wonderful little details we can see in the zoomed in image. Now what you've got here is a little white castle on a tiny little island and a little ship with a tiny sail, and these are less than a millimetre in size. They're absolutely minuscule on the object, but there you have this little area which originally would have been silver leaf. Now that has tarnished over the years, and so it is kind of dirty and grey, but would have glowed silver. So you would have had a tiny island with a castle on it and a ship sailing in this sea made of silver round this island. Now this seems to represent England. The white castle possibly being the Tower of London, which in this area was painted white, known as the White Tower even today. So there it is, the Tower of London on the island of Great Britain, with the ship sailing through the English Channel below. which would chime with the idea of the standard with the flag representing England itself. But if we take this a step further, we find that in Shakespeare's play, obviously published centuries later, of Richard II, and I've got my trusty copy of it here, there's the famous speech delivered by John of Gaunt, which goes like this: "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England." So that's how John of Gaunt describes England in Shakespeare's play Richard II, and it contains that powerful line, "This precious stone set in the silver sea." Now this would have been a precious stone in this painting, the island of England set in a silver sea. Now this could be a coincidence, but the fact that this particular text appears in Shakespeare's Richard II, the very play about the king for which this object was produced, seems like an extraordinary link. It's possible that Shakespeare would have seen the Wilton Diptych as it was still in the royal collection when he was alive. So there's every chance he might have encountered it, and maybe it inspired this text. Who knows? It's a wonderful thing to speculate, though. The object itself left the royal collection, was sold to the Earls of Pembroke, and spent much of its life in Wilton House near Salisbury, hence the name Wilton Diptych today. It's of course now in the collection of the National Gallery. And to conclude our story of this object, I thought I'd say something about how Richard's reign ends, because it's not a particularly happy one, and this is detailed in Shakespeare's play. What happens is Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Hereford, I mentioned him earlier, unhappy with Richard's reign, he is temporarily banished for a dispute with another baron from England. He's only banished for a short amount of time, but during that period his father John of Gaunt dies, and instead of Henry Bolingbroke inheriting that fortune, Richard increases his banishment to life and steals his inheritance. Bolingbroke eventually comes back to England, he gathers supporters to his cause, he rises with other barons and other supporters against Richard, deposes him, crowns himself Henry IV, and has Richard imprisoned. And ultimately Richard is starved to death in the dungeons of Pontefract Castle. This kicks off centuries, decades of discussions and conflict over the true inheritance of the English throne. Richard, of course, was grandson of Edward III, but so was Henry Bolingbroke, not through the Black Prince, but through John of Gaunt, who was the Black Prince's brother. So there's these two competing lines, and when Henry IV deposes Richard II, different fractions start to emerge, and ultimately this leads to the Wars of the Roses, which isn't resolved until Henry VII is crowned and unifies the two warring houses. It's a very complex story for another time, but this object sits at the beginning of that hugely important time in British history and is an object of extreme beauty and an amazing survival from the period. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Wilton Diptych. If you did, please leave a like, comment if you've got any questions about this artwork, or if you've got any requests for future paintings, sculptures, pieces of architecture you'd like me to cover. And if you're enjoying the content, please subscribe to my channel. And I'll see you in the next video.